And we're back like we never left. Oregon fans, what's going on? How's everybody living? Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. I'm your host, Max Torres, coming to you live on both YouTube and Twitter on a Friday afternoon. Super stoked for today's episode because I get to bring on a good friend of mine and, a fellow writer in the Oregon market and a fellow Zag. We got Erik Skopil of DuckTerritory out here on the show today. We're going to talk some spring ball and then maybe get some mailbag questions in from you guys that are here live in the chat. So throw some in there if you have some. We'll do our best to get to them. But Erik, how we doing, man? Great to have you on.
Are we carving out some time to talk Zags at the end? We have some Zags.
If you want to talk about some heartbreak, we can do that.
Yeah,
just another year.
Maybe we put it off. Maybe we hold off. Maybe we stick with some more uplifting things like Oregon football. Let's do that.
For sure. Yeah, man. So like I was telling Erik before, we're kind of just riffing on this episode. Don't really have a lot of concrete plans, but I think that's kind of what you get to do when you're, kind of eating, sleeping, breathing all of the Oregon football that we can possibly handle. But so what I wanted to start with, Erik, was just to kind of get some of your thoughts on spring ball. You were out there in Eugene getting to go to the pressers, getting to go to practices.
Yeah.
So maybe we could just kind of open it up a little bit about, where the Ducks are right now as we kind of head towards fall camp and some of your takeaways.
Yeah. And as you know, access can be kind of limited. So the big day and opportunity to really learn much came on the 29th with yourself and everyone else watching. Like the spring game at this point, with the way practice was run, really was kind of the big day to take things away. So I rewatched that game 12 times. I rewatched it last night. I think, I don't know if we want to run through all the spring game thoughts necessarily, but I think just big picture coming out of spring, like a couple of things stand out. I think offensively, you get the sense that not much is going to change under Will Stein from what we saw under Kenny Dillingham. I think that was kind of one of the clear components of it in terms of talking with him, talking with players, talking with Knicks. It's just like a lot of this is going to look very similar to what we saw last year. And, the old adage of if it isn't broke, don't fix it probably applies here, where Oregon offensively was certainly one of the best teams on the West Coast, one of the better teams nationally in most of the statistical categories. So it makes sense to kind of have some continuity there. You've got Nick's back as somebody who can clearly have a pretty big role in terms of actually running the offense and making decisions at the line. That's another thing that'll carry over. So I think offensively, you're going to see, schematically, it sounds like it'll be pretty similar to what we saw at least last year. And then there's some question marks at some of the skill positions that we can get to. There's some offensive line stuff that certainly that was probably one of the bigger points of disappointment from the spring game. Was there were some kind of low points there, but a lot of guys out, and of course they're not working as a cohesive group because of the way they split it. So it's hard to take too much. And then defensively, I thought a couple things really stood out. I think the big one was, with so many issues last year in coverage. We've talked about this over at Odds and Audible, so I'll pimp out my own podcast.
Go for it.
Just of that, it was pretty notable to me that they moved, Jamal Hill over to play inside linebacker after working in the defensive backfield the last couple of years. And, and that they were cross training a lot of their corners to play safety or nickel. It just, you got a sense. And even with some of the recruiting decisions in terms of the players they're bringing in, of how much they valued getting better coverage athletes on the field. And I thought that kind of bear throughout spring. And we haven't talked, Max, about your takeaways in the spring game, but one of my big ones was just that the defense top to bottom looked better than what we saw a year ago. So I'm pretty encouraged there. You got to really, I think another part to me is the defensive line is super experienced. I was just looking through it yesterday of I think there's 83 combined return starts amongst 5 guys with at least 4 years of college experience. That's just a lot. So, so I think offensively you feel like it's going to look pretty similar to last year, and you're hoping defensively it's going to look a little different, and that some of the younger guys that you brought in or some of the portal players are going to make differences. And again, I think some of the decisions to move guys around was interesting, and I'll be kind of curious to see how all that plays out come fall.
Sure. So let's just start on offense, and we can kind of sprinkle in some spring game tidbits as we see fit. I think the offensive line would probably be the biggest question mark right now, if you want to call it that. On that side of the ball, seeing that they lost so many starters from a year ago only makes sense. But I think this is really shaping up to be an excellent situation for Erik Terry to slide into, even though, he's the youngest coach on the staff, pretty much, at least as an assistant, with his
Right.
own room. But it's not like the cupboard's bare there, right? You got Connerly coming back. You got Stephen Jones, Marcus Harper, Jackson Powers Johnson, and then you bring in some really good transfers in Junior Angelau and Johnny Cornelius. So I think it's only realistic and maybe logical to expect that group to take a quote unquote step back, but that doesn't mean it's going to be a bad group by any means. You knew that they had to shore up that group if they wanted to get Bo Nix to come back for another year. That was obviously a piece of the puzzle. And then it looks like kind of what you were saying. Will Stein wants to pick up where Kenny Dillingham left off, find a little bit of what worked for them last year and keep that going, and then kind of add some of his own wrinkles from UTSA maybe.
Yeah, no, and to the offensive line part, like, to be clear, I think they have talent on the roster. Just the spring game as a whole, and these matchups are always misleading. I mean, one of the big storylines of the 2021 spring was like DJ Johnson just obliterating people, and then you go back and watch it, and it was like Theope and Bailey Jaramillo facing off against him. And so some of this was just a matter of there's more defensive line depth in terms of quality of players going up against, like, at times, like, it was great to see Popo Amava had a couple nice kind of plays in terms of pass rush, but you look up and you go, well, he's going against Charlie Pickard, who's like a walk-on, who's probably never going to be somebody you actually see on the field. And that was just one incident I picked up on last night. There was a bunch of them that were similar. So, some of that stuff is probably exacerbated in terms of the concerns, but I think watching the spring game several times again, it was kind of startling how frequent various defenders were in the backfield for both sides and the impacts that had. I mean, I think Ty was really up and down, and I think a lot of the first half struggles were to the fact that, like, Mace Funa just beasted a Johnny Cornelius on like 3 straight plays. If you go back and watch that, which is part of why I'm a little concerned, because I just thought he would hold up a little better there, and over the course of the game, it got better. But some of the stuff is not necessarily like a lack of talent, but it's like you wonder what it looks like together, and the fact that we never really got to see that is maybe not concerning, but it's something that you're going to be kind of wanting to watch when you get into fall. Particularly, like, it seems like you kind of nailed it. Like, the 2 tackles are pretty clearly Connerly and Cornelius, and I'm really excited by that. I've said a couple times, I think that's one of the more, maybe the most athletic offensive tackle pairings we've seen Oregon have, which in terms of like 2 NFL caliber athletes out there. They're a little bit smaller. They're not the TJ Bass and Big Saul, the tackles last year, are much bigger people, but both these guys are a lot more athletic. And then, JPJ in the middle makes sense, and Stephen Jones has starting experience, but that left guard spot kind of felt like it was going to be either Junior Angelau or Marcus Harper, but neither guy were healthy for the spring game. And so we really didn't get a sense of that. So that's why I guess I have some questions there. I don't know if it's major concerns quite yet, but the standard, and I guess the other point I'll say is the standard was so high last year with this offensive line, and you think of the success that the offense as a whole had. I think you give a lot of credit and you tip your cap a lot to those guys, but you just kind of wonder what's the, not to be too concerned here, but what's the impact potentially if that takes a step back, or how much of a step back does it take, and how does that impact what Bo can do and what the offense as a whole can do?
Yeah, because keeping Bo upright is obviously going to be a major priority, and the mark has been set incredibly high from last year. I think it was 5 sacks allowed on the entire year, which is elite. That's like the only other way you can put it.
Best nationally.
Yeah,
Best nationally.
Exactly. So yeah, I mean, you put it right. Not maybe a concern, but some question marks. Just kind of, we don't know what that group's going to look like together. Leak Terry was really, really complimentary of Josh Connerly, just talking about how he's like the hardest worker in that room. And I think someone also said that he might have the best feet in that room. And putting that job protecting Bo Nix's blind side on an underclassman isn't really something we've seen since Penei Sewell was at Oregon. And that's not an easy job to have on your shoulders, but it looks, at least right now, like they're very willing to put that on, Josh Connerly right now. And he's, taking that in stride. I don't want to spend too much time on the offensive line, although I know it is a very intriguing position.
Sure.
I did kind of want to pick your brain a little bit about tight end, because it's an interesting situation the Ducks find themselves in right now with Terrence Ferguson getting banged up in the spring. I think I was talking about it and writing about it, about how Cam McCormick and Maliki Montevau's transfers are stinging a little bit more right now, because you had to finish at least more than maybe they projected to sting when they initially left. Is kind of what I'm saying, but you have to pivot a little bit. You kind of throw Kenyon Sadiq into the fire. I think you got good confidence in Patrick Herbert, seeing that he finished his first, full healthy season, which is an accomplishment for him with how banged up he's been. And then, you kind of exit spring ball by dipping into the portal to grab Casey Kelly from Ole Miss. So I just kind of wanted to get some of your thoughts on that room and how they project to be next year.
Just to start, I think one thing that really interests me, and I've mentioned already, we both talked about Stein and how similar the offense will be. I guess one area that I just am wondering aloud about, given the lack of bodies, is will they use tight ends with this higher frequency? And because a year ago, they had four guys play, I think, over 150 snaps amongst, Ferguson, and then you mentioned the two that left and Patrick Herbert, and so if they are going to utilize the tight end position the way they used it last year, that means it's literally all hands on deck from a scholarship perspective. That means all four guys are going to have big roles. It makes sense why they've offered and are kind of still actively looking at other portal options. But if there is going to be a difference of approach there where you don't see the tight end on the, a traditional tight end on the field so frequently, and I do think it's notable that you look at the two prep tight ends that Oregon has signed or will sign, hopefully, in the case of AJ Pugliano. Those are both kind of smaller, more like tweener body types. And I just kind of wonder if the sense here long term will be that they're going to carry, one inline guy for specific packages, but utilize a guy like Kenyon a lot and the Terrence Ferguson, even though he's a bigger athlete, a lot in terms of flexing those guys out. So I guess I'm not really sure exactly what the role is going to be at tight end. And if it is kind of a different approach, then I'm not as concerned. But if they are intending to utilize all four and play them a ton like we saw last year, I do get a little bit nervous about that, because I don't know if I don't really know a ton about Casey Kelly in terms of he's just somebody that was added recently. His production at Ole Miss certainly wasn't incredible. Kenyon Sadiq is a true freshman, and Patrick Herbert has had his own injury issues. And you compare that to the group they had last year, and it's certainly that group, at least last year, had a couple other guys that were more capable. So I think there's reason, again, to at least look at the tight end room and not feel like that's a strength, because I don't think it is offensively. I think there's a lot of areas to really like, but you do kind of wonder after you get past Ferguson, what do you have? But at the end of the day, to the point I'm kind of trying to make here, if Ferguson is the only tight end you're going to utilize with high frequency, and maybe the tight end position gets kind of limited a little bit in terms of what it does, then it probably doesn't hurt you as much. But I do find it to be kind of interesting, just sort of what they've chosen to do there. And it'll be interesting to see, I guess, if they actually ultimately do pull the trigger and land a fifth scholarship tight end, because that would probably speak to the fact that they are going to be a little bit more involved in the offense than maybe they could be.
I saw this one interesting hypothetical thrown out, the other day, whether it was on my show or on social media or wherever it was. And I don't think it's likely by any means, but I kind of just wanted to throw it out there. I think I saw someone mention like, hey, why don't the Ducks, have Kyler Casper working a little bit at tight end because he is so big. And then, we also had, Mateo Lele taking some snaps at tight end. But I kind of just wanted to throw that out there again. I don't think it's likely because, Casper is a receiver, but he's the biggest receiver in that room. And that room's pretty crowded, right? With Trayshawn Holden, Tez Johnson, Chris Hudson, Troy Franklin, and, some Justice Lowe. You got some younger guys in there. So I don't know. It's just kind of interesting to see how they had to pivot a little bit and, maybe some of the options that they have on this roster, given the depth along the D line. But you probably want Mateo full-time D-line.
Mateo was intriguing. I mean, the fact that he actually played there in the spring game was kind of intriguing. I mean, and again, it was really limited, so it's hard to take much from it. I mean, he was a pretty celebrated two-way athlete, out of St. John Bosco. I'm sure, Max, you know about that even more than I do, living down there and watching some of his games. But, I think that one would make sense because if you need a fifth body to be a regular out there, and maybe he plays 70 snaps all season on offense, but whatever the number is, 400 on defense, that probably isn't a terrible thing. I don't know if Casper makes sense to me just because of the weight part of it. We don't have updated weights. He was listed at 195 last year, 6'6", 195. I can't imagine, just having walked around him, I can't imagine he's much more than like 210 right now. I think he's still pretty slight of build. So, maybe you could, speaking to what I was talking about earlier of like the Kenyon Sadiq and kind of these more hybrid tight end roles, like maybe he can fit into something like that. But if you're asking him to play like a more traditional inline position, like what Herbert and obviously what like Matavau and McCormick were doing mostly last year, I would say that doesn't really fit, but that doesn't mean they can't create certain matchups with him that would be
Sure.
similar to a tight end. I just don't know if like strictly playing tight end that adds up for me, unless he's going to bulk up a bunch. Which, if you've seen photos of his dad, like there is certainly room to grow and add weight because um, his
His
dad's
dad shredded.
his dad's a shredded guy, and Kyler's still really light. So I mean, I think ultimately Kyler's probably going to play at like 6'6", 225, 230, maybe even
Like a
if he wants
Jawan
to.
Johnson deal.
Yeah, if he wants to, but like right now, I think he's a little bit light on that part. So I don't know if I just think you would be a major mismatch if he's out there trying to block like defensive ends and linebackers with his current body type.
And then there's also the challenge, Eric, that you always have when guys get to high school or from the high school ranks to the college ranks. Kyler, his billing coming out of high school was like freak athlete, really good ball skills, body control. But as you add that weight, you don't want to lose that athleticism. You don't want to lose that explosiveness, that mobility. Not to say that that's going to happen, but it's just something that you have to consider. And, I was over at St. John Bosco at their showcase. Junior Adams offered a trio of wideouts from Bosco earlier this week. And I was kind of talking about Mateo with, some people around that program saying that, he was really doing a good job, catching passes just during spring ball at Oregon. But he kind of maybe prefers a little bit more of the defensive side of the ball. And then kind of like you were saying last year, the big thing with him was that he was focusing more so on defense instead of having to be used on offense, but had some big games against Mater Dei where they were kind of trailing and they needed to turn to somebody, and they turned to Mateo, and he came up pretty big. Speaking of Mateo, let's switch to the defensive side of the ball for a little bit here, Eric. Mateo is obviously one of the biggest recruits that the Ducks have landed in the Dan Lanning era. Him, Tosh Lapoy, and Tony Tuioti all played a big role there. I want to talk a little bit about him and just kind of how you think he's adjusting to the college game after seeing him in the spring game. And then also, we got to talk about Jordan Birch because he is like the story on Oregon's defensive front and trying to take that group from good to great, like we heard all throughout spring, and take them to the next level.
I mean, with Mateo, like I think when you've been around, so you understand this, Max. Like the first thing you're looking at with true freshmen when they arrive is just like physically, does it look like it makes sense?
It makes sense.
Yeah, with Mateo, it 100% does. And I was just gonna say, like every year, there's a couple of guys that come through, and you're like, oh, like, and here's an example that I think I've shared with you is Harrison Taggart was one where everybody has 4-star recruit linebacker, everyone was excited about him. I couldn't have picked him from a walk on walking through the line. He just looked unimpressive compared to what you expected for a recruit with that kind of a ranking, right? And you see like a Kyler Casper is another example, a guy who comes in, you go, oh, he's leaner than I expected he would be. I think even Kenyon Sadiq for me was just a little bit physically smaller than I thought he would be. That doesn't mean he can't contribute because we've already kind of established like there might be roles for him, even though he's not, a traditional 245 to 250 pound tight end. But Mateo, it was like, oh, like yeah, this looks good, and I think that sort of shown through in the spring game. Like he had some really nice moments again, going against walk-on offensive linemen. So I think we have to be careful in terms of being like, man, when he was in the backfield crushing, I think it was I'm trying to remember who the running back was. Maybe it was Bucky or Noah. Like, wow, that was awesome. But then you have to recall, like, well, I think he was also going against Charlie Pickard. So that part has to be at least considered. But no, I think Oregon doesn't have a ton of options off the edge, and that maybe is a good transition into Birch. You need one of these young guys to be a contributor, whether it's Mateo or Tatum, or I think Amarian Winston had a really strong spring, and actually I think if you were just to watch the highlights again, probably as good of a spring game as Mateo, or pretty close. Like he had a bull rush on Connerly that almost led to a sack that was one of the better pressures of the day. So like there are some options, but they're all really young, and you need one or two of those guys to be contributors. And Mateo makes by far the most sense. And then to Jordan Birch, like I thought he had a really strong spring game quietly. I know he didn't record any stats, but I think physically you can see that he's just a different body type than really anyone else that they have on the roster, especially when you compare that with some of the athletic stuff. And I keep hearing about this spin move that's supposedly so special. I haven't seen it. Everybody talks about it when they talk about what does he bring and talk about a spin move. So I'm excited to see what that looks like. We haven't got a chance, but just to the big picture here, we talked about how the offensive line like never allowed 5 sacks all season, which was I think a program record and the best nationally. Well, on the flip side, the defense never got home. Like they just didn't get to the quarterback. And I think I was just writing about this earlier today. I was doing a recap of the different incoming transfers to the portal, and I think it's really important that Birch is a guy. Like if he's not a guy, that's a huge issue for them because this is otherwise it's pretty much the same personnel up there that it was a year ago where you did have some issues. I know Popo's back, and I think that's quietly a
And
bigger
no one seems
story.
to be talking about that.
Yeah, because like in 2021 when he was healthy, like he was really really effective in pass downs as like an internal pass rusher, and the fact that he missed all last season, like, I think that's a big story, but not as big as Birch because they need guys off the edge. And DJ had a couple of nice games last year, but for the most part was pretty quiet. I thought Dorless had kind of an underwhelming season in totality, but like I think like Birch is such a crucial piece to all of this. And you saw things that were encouraging in the spring game, but of course we saw a year ago DJ Johnson had like a million sacks in the spring game, and then he had the same number during the regular season or whatever. So you don't want to get too optimistic, but I think he's really important. And again, didn't have a ton of opportunity to see him in practice, but physically he obviously kind of fits the bill pretty well.
Yeah, and when I've been talking about Birch, throughout the spring and everything, it's obviously not the same player, but just from the physical caliber of a guy you're getting, I kind of likened him to Jason Jones, who's
Mm,
now at Auburn. Obviously the guys move completely differently, but just in terms of the sheer size of the dude, I think that's someone worth mentioning just in terms of the caliber of guy that you need along the defensive front to take that group to the next level. And then I think when you pair him or combine him with Popo, Dorless, Taki, Casey Rogers, just
mm.
the sheer depth that they have in the interior, those offensive lines that they're going against are going to have their hands full, and somebody's going to have to break through. So I think just that's obviously one of the big storylines that we're going to be monitoring as we head towards fall camp. It's just the development of the pass rush. And it's important to note that it can't be all on Birch. I totally agree
Yeah,
with you, Eric. I almost said Skopil.
you can say
Skopil.
that.
Well, I don't usually talk to you like that. So no, but like Eric, I think that's a good point. Like it's super crucial that he shows up and has an impact this year, but it can't all be on him. You got to have the rest of the group, especially in the interior, getting some good push, because I think that's where you can really solidify yourself as a difference maker when it comes to, a defensive front.
Just one component I think that should be talked about is last year you had the issue where you had maybe not plus pass rushers, but also not plus coverage guys in the back end. Some of these issues get rectified in terms of pass rush if the guys on the outside just can keep their guy from being open for a second or two longer, which I think is the hope with some of these moves. Again, I mentioned that earlier. That was just one of the big things that stood out to me was that I think Dan pretty clearly went and looked at last year's roster and last year's team and said we just didn't have enough elite coverage guys in the field. They're guys who can stick with people just hip to hip, man on man. And they went out and not only did they bring in three, a couple guys from the SEC who are pretty highly regarded defensive backs. They brought Evan Williams in, but then I just think that Jamal Hill move sort of signified something to me of like they want to put at linebacker in particular better athletes there. I think Devin Jackson's a guy who certainly fits the bill, and Justin Jacobs. But in general, you just kind of hope that coverage is better across the board because if that is the case, then the two kind of work hand in hand in terms of getting home to the quarterback too.
No, completely agree. I think that's definitely been a big talking point this offseason. I have one more question I wanted to ask you before we get to some big picture things. You mentioned Jamal Hill moving to inside backer and how that group has kind of struggled in coverage, of late. I think that was a, the primary knock on Noah Sewell, as he was going to the NFL. Was just how he moves well, pretty well, and he's really physical and great against the run, but that's kind of where he left a little bit to be desired. And the Ducks aren't exactly overflowing with depth at that position. But you add a guy like Justin Jacobs, who was pretty highly regarded at Iowa until he got banged up, tried to come back from injury, and then things got worse. But now he looks like he's healthy. You got Jeffrey Bossa coming back. You got Devin Jackson, like you mentioned, Connor Soley. Jerry Mixon is the only true linebacker that they signed in the 23 class. Important to note that I think that the Ducks play a 4-2-5 defense, so you don't need a lot of bodies there. But what are your thoughts on where that group's at and, kind of what they have in that room when it comes to the 2023 season?
Yeah, we just kind of talked about this on our podcast a couple of days ago. Of like, I think it's pretty easy um, to be discouraged by where the linebacker play was a year ago. You've touched on it already, and I think the issue was just general athleticism for me. I think Noah was playing injured. He's already said as much. And there were times where he just wasn't a very good fit in this defense and tried to play in space with faster athletes, right? And so I think it's pretty clear with what they've done in the portal, with the position move we mentioned, and just with kind of what they're developing. Like I think Devin Jackson's a really great fit for what they want to do out there, just in terms of the speed and athleticism. So I look at what they're doing and I say, this all makes a lot of sense. Like it makes a ton of sense to get faster, more athletic. This is what if you look at Georgia's linebackers, like a Kobe Dean, smaller guy, extremely quick, extremely intuitive. I think Oregon hopefully has some guys that could blend that athleticism, and kind of that instincts. Because I personally think that was where Jeffrey Bossa was a problem a year ago, where sure, he's got a lot of the athletic intangibles, but there were times where he just didn't really seem like he had a nose for the football, or a great read on kind of where he needed to be in coverage. So like you hope there's been improvements made there. And that's one of the things they talked about during this spring was just you should see big improvements from some of these linebackers when they have more time in this scheme. So I'm hoping you see improvements there. But the point I made yesterday on our pod when we were talking about this was last year's team undoubtedly had more highly rated recruits with the pair of Sewell and Flo and those guys. And this year's group, like even Keith Brown was a former top 150 recruit, I believe. So like that's a pretty highly rated guy. This year's group doesn't have quite the same caliber of recruit across the board. That's the determining part, but I think just from a fit with the defense and a general, like I said, speed and athleticism perspective, like I think there's reason to think they can be better. I don't know if it's going to be a ton better. And in fact, I think when I did my position rankings yesterday, I had them 7th out of 8 groups, the linebacking unit, because I think there's more question marks there than there are at a lot of other spots. But certainly, I don't think the cupboard's bare, like the ceiling is low. I just think you do have to look up and go, like, if you want to be objective with it, like Jacobs is your probably your alpha guy, but he's coming off injury. Bossa was, again, PFF thought he was basically the worst starting linebacker in the conference. And then the other 3 that you expect to see play a lot, Connor Sewell didn't play a ton at ASU last year, and neither Jamal Hill or Devin Jackson were playing linebacker really at all last year for Oregon. At least not. I mean, Hill wasn't at all, and Devin played, I think, the first 4 games, but nothing since. So if you want to be kind of, again, cautious and not like hyping things up too much, you can say like legitimately across the board, one of the guys you're expecting to be a major factor at linebacker played big snaps at all last year at Oregon, and that player was like based upon, again, I don't know how much you want to play. I don't know. Actually, I don't even know, Max. Do you care about PFF? Is that something you look at?
I look at it. I don't have a subscription, so I just kind of take a peek once it shows up on Twitter or something, or someone writes a story about it.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I don't think it has to be an end all or be all, but just saying that, like, at least one service who was assessing things didn't think Jeff Bossa was very good last year. I don't know if I think he was as bad as the numbers say, but if you want to be kind of more cautious here on the linebacker unit, that would be the argument. Is a lot of this is unproven, even though I think what they've done personnel wise makes a lot of sense makes more sense than what they had last year, at least.
Talking with Erik Skopil here on the Ducks Dish podcast. He's at Erik_Skopil on Twitter. He's the football and women's basketball beat writer over on DuckTerritory. So make sure you guys give him a follow. But Erik, I think another interesting question I just wanted to throw out there for you. I know you've been on this beat longer than I have. So you've gotten to see a couple different coaching staffs come through Eugene. Before I ask the question, who was the first staff that you covered?
Well, I guess I was technically around when Chip was here for one fall, but that was very. I'll give myself credit for that, but I was like an intern who wasn't asking questions, who was just attending. Like the first time I was actually kind of actively reporting would have been Helfrich's first year.
Okay, so we'll throw it, Chip Kelly, Helfrich era, kind of around that timeline. So you've been around covering them since then, and then now Dan Lanning comes to town after winning a national championship with Georgia. We got a taste of what's in store on a 10-win season. What are some of the differences that you think are pretty noticeable? Whether it's the approach, practice energy, what we see on the field. What are some of the differences that you've seen and that you think are worth mentioning here as we head into the second year of Dan Lanning's tenure at Oregon?
That's a good question, Max. I think the buy-in is really apparent. I think the culture is really strong, and I think culture is such a funny thing because it's something we talk a lot about, and it's really hard to kind of define what that means. I remember 2019 under Mario Cristobal, like culture was everybody was talking about how great the culture was and how much everybody cared for each other, right? And that was obviously a really special season. We know what happened there. There's like definitely similar vibes right now, in my opinion, to where that was, and just in terms of how people are talking about the situation, and I think that's a really positive thing. I don't know if that necessarily differentiates Dan from Mario or past coaches necessarily. I just think that's something that has kind of stood out as an observer. Um, I think Dan. I mean, just like to the person, I think Dan's compared to Mario, who was probably just the comparison to make because they're, Willie was barely here. Mark Helfrich was very different from Dan Lanning in terms of basically everything. But I think what I see from Dan is he seems like a person that has a little bit more going on in his life than just football, which is I think something that is which is, I mean, like, I just remember when we asked Mario Cristobal what his Thanksgiving plans were, and he didn't mention his family the entire time. And you're kind of going like, typically that's a day where not to be judgmental of what happens in the Cristobal household, because I have a lot of respect for Mario, but that stood out. Whereas one of the things Dan makes point of bringing up is the value of breaks for his coaches to spend time with their families. So again, I'm not saying that's like a huge distinction, and I don't know behind the scenes if that's different at all. Just one of the things that kind of stood out is it seems like Dan is somebody who's got a little bit more going on, and not that he isn't focused on football, but it seems like he's balancing the work life part of it as best he can, which is I imagine would be incredibly difficult. Um, yeah, I don't know. Like that's always a hard one to answer in terms of kind of some of the more, I guess, like intrinsic factors in all of this. But those are things I guess that just kind of stand out in terms of differentiating factors. And Dan's also, I would say, quicker with the in terms of the media. Like he's pretty darn tough up there. He's advanced almost
Oh
compared to
yeah.
where you'd expect him to be with how he handles questions. Mario got to a point where he kind of played our game a little bit. We're still playing Dan's game, is what I would say. Dan still kind of runs it up there, and very, very infrequently do we get something over on him or surprise him with the question. And what I've noticed with Dan in terms of that is when you do beat him, I want to say beat him, like it's not like a competition, but when you do get a situation where maybe you get an answer where you can kind of tell maybe he didn't want to share that piece of information, he's very quick the next time a similar situation pops up to have the right, deflecting answer
He
so he
studies
doesn't
the
have to
tape.
go into it. I think he breaks the tape down. I think he does. I break the tape down. I think
So
Dan
do
breaks the
I.
tape down. I watch all the. I'm taking notes all the time on these interviews. That's the way to do it. So
For sure, for sure. Yeah, because I mean, I've only covered two coaches since I got into the sports writing industry. Mario, I was boots on the ground, and then Dan, I was boots on the ground for a spring before the move. So since then, it's been kind of from a distance, but I watch all the pressers and everything. And the one thing that Dan will absolutely make sure of is one of the journalism 101 questions that you learn, Erik, is
oh
if you
yeah.
ask a yes or no question, you're going to get a yes or no answer.
Mm.
I know that some people try to sneak one in there sometimes, but he's cut from that SEC cloth, and he's going to try to keep a tight lip on things that he doesn't want to talk about.
Yeah, I was on the wrong end of that recently. It was a tough day. Tough. Didn't feel good about it. Bad self scout after that one. Need to work on a question variance.
No, you got to ask him sometimes. You got to try. But I mean, we've all been in that situation before.
Yep.
And we got a couple questions here. I want to try to open up the mailbag portion a bit.
Okay.
All since everyone gets plenty of me, they don't get a lot of you on this show, Erik. I'm going to toss it to you first. This
Mhm.
one comes from Cha Cooley. Question: It seems Dilly had the spring game play calling on fire. Did it seem to you guys that the offensive scheme left a lot to be desired, or is it too early to tell? Was Dilly a big loss?
It's too early to tell if Dilly was a big loss. I mean, I think just inherently somebody who goes from being a one-stop coordinator and having the success he had to being a head coach at a competing Pac-12 school, like that sort of speaks to the fact that yeah, like on face value, it should be seen as a pretty big loss. That doesn't mean that the replacement with Stein can't make up for it or be 95% or 100% of it, right? To the scheme part, like I don't know. I thought they took a lot of shots that just weren't successful. I think that was one of the things that just in watching it, like the very first game or for first play for the Green offense with Knicks was a shot downfield to Franklin where he had a step on Dante Manning and the ball just sailed a couple of yards. And there were a couple of other miscues there. And like I was just thinking about this yesterday while I was watching again of like how this is kind of a bit of a tangent off, but I'll bring it back of like how different our conversations around Justice Lowe is this offseason if he just catches the one long touchdown, because that's how, again, we have so little to base our opinions off of. But if Justice Lowe has if he completes the catch, we're like, oh man, Justice Lowe, is he the sixth guy? Like, is he that next guy
Did you
in
see
there?
him in spring?
Did you see that touchdown? Like he really made a case for himself and he dropped it. And now no one will talk about him, but kind of to that, I guess, to that point, like if that ball is caught, we're talking about the offense. Like, hey, they did connect on like three kind of long touchdown passes or three, touchdown passes of whatever it would be, 25, 30 yards or more. That would be a little bit of a different conversation. And they did have success, throwing the ball downfield. I know obviously the long test pass is a short pass turned into a long touchdown, but Ty hit Chris Hudson deep. Bo found Troy a couple of times or a couple other times where there were defensive holds because the receiver got back. So I don't think that the scheme, I don't think they were necessarily not taking shots or not being aggressive. I just think sometimes those plays just didn't connect.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned it, that play on the Justice Lowe, almost touchdown. I feel like I found myself talking about it from Dante Manning's perspective. I'm like, oh man, I liked what I saw from Dante on that play, because he's one of those corners that, he's the highest corner the Ducks have ever signed, and they're still kind of waiting for him to solidify himself as that guy. And he was saying, kind of a put up or shut up year again. So it's just funny how you can look at, the same play from a couple different angles. And, but to his credit, I did think that Justice Lowe looked pretty good. And then I kind of agree with you on the same front as far as, too early to tell. I do think Dilly was a loss from a recruiting standpoint, not to say that Stein can't be as good or better of a recruiter, but I mean, you look what Dillingham did on the recruiting trail, getting Dante Moore, that was huge. Getting Bo Nix obviously was huge. And then even when he got to Tempe, getting Jaden Rashada, who was one of the better passers in the class. So that's an interesting part to kind of peel the layers back. Question from Eric: when does fall camp officially start? Is that when we'll get our next media availabilities? I want to say the next media availability will probably be Pac-12 Media Day in Vegas, but I don't know if you have anything else on this front.
No, I in terms of Oregon sanctioned things, that would be start of fall. Pac-12 related things, as Max just said, that'll be the Pac-12 Media Day, which I think is like the second week of July in Las Vegas. I can't remember the date. I want to say it's like the 10th or the 12th. You might have.
I thought it was the like the 20th or 21st. I know that I was a bit bummed because I'm actually going to be on vacation during that time, and I come back like the day after it happens. So
right,
of course, but yeah, I think Pac-12 Media Day is probably our next.
Is the next one. And then to the first part, I don't have a date, but other Eric, nice to have another Eric on the show. I think we're looking at first week of August, like normal. I would imagine, I think last year it was like a Tuesday because, so I would imagine maybe the first Tuesday of August. I don't have a calendar in front of me, so I don't know what date that would be, but somewhere in that range. And then of course we'll have the day before the first day of fall. Will also be Oregon's own media day where they'll have Dan come out and speak. And then last year, I thought it was great. They had, I think, 16 student athletes come out and go to 4 different stations and had them split up into 4 different, might have even been more than 16. I can't remember, but they had a bunch of guys. And so I think that'll also be something to look forward to. But yeah, I mean, we're going to be in a dry season right now in terms of actual interview sessions with Dan and players. And I'm sure there will be some players on podcasts and coaches on different podcasts. We're trying to do that over on ours. But in terms of just like U of O sanction stuff, we're kind of in a bit of a dry period.
For sure. Well, I know we got a little bit more time with you, Eric. I got one more question I want to try to sneak in before we get you out of here. Richard talking about why did Mateo drop from a 5-star to a 4-star after committing to Oregon? I think that was, I want to say that was on 247. I know that you guys bring, Greg Biggins on, not trying to like point the finger or anything, because I've heard a little bit, but we've been talking about Mateo quite a bit on today's show. So maybe we could both offer our 2 cents.
I don't have a great explanation. I've never asked Greg straight up on that one. I don't think it's a cause and effect of he commits to Oregon, he drops his star. I don't think that's a thing that happens, even though sometimes it looks like it happens. I'm not saying it's never been a thing where I mean, maybe there was some bias in the past. I just, having talked to people, like that's not really something that's on the table. But um, yeah, I don't have a great answer for why he dropped. And I was actually just trying to pull up the archived rankings to see how far he dropped at the end there.
I want to
But
say it was like 30 spots almost. I could be
yeah,
remembering that wrong. But I think part of what I had heard, because I try to listen to Greg when I can, and I check out your guys' show a lot. You do a great job. I think part of it was because of maybe not seeing as much top end production as they maybe had hoped to see. And I think part of that goes along with what we were talking about going back and forth between D line and tight end. So just kind of trying to tap into that full potential. But to his credit, I was around Mateo a lot last year. I was at both of the games against Mater Dei. He really showed up in those biggest games when they needed him most. And rankings aren't going to be the end all be all, but folks that like to follow recruiting always want to know, what's going on with the rankings, and is Oregon getting shortchanged of the hype that they've kind of generated sometimes.
Oh, and I'll just say, I guess, last thing. I know I'm wearing a 24/7 sports hat. I'm employed there. I have nothing to do with the recruiting rankings. If there's a sense that I'm involved, I genuinely have. I go to a couple camps, and if people ask me like if a guy looked good, I'll be like yes or no. But I don't have any insight really on these recruiting rankings. Just to be clear, if that's the sense that people maybe were getting.
No, fair enough, fair enough. Well, Erik, it's been an awesome show, man. I mean, I could talk to you for hours if we both had the time. But any kind of final thoughts here on Oregon football and where the Ducks are at, you think, as we kind of start turning our attention to fall camp, even though it's like a good 3 months away, 3+ months?
Oh gosh, yeah, no, this is the. I feel like this is the weirdly the most painful part of the year because we just got our taste, and it was like a month of just football, 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 and now we've got these couple of months where there's just again, it's kind of a dry spell. So, um, yeah, this is the time of year where I'm rewatching games from last year and kind of just doing some busy work almost in terms of trying to assess where the team is at. And I guess the portal could still provide some answers. So that's something to kind of keep an eye out for. How does Oregon utilize its last, couple of scholarships? Because they do have a couple to deal with now. And I think there's some positions, not, I don't know how much we want to get into that to address, whether it be maybe another tight end or there's certainly some receivers that they're known to be in on. There's a couple of interior offensive linemen. They're defensive backs. So they're clearly, kind of kicking the tires on several different options and whatnot. So that'll be a thing to kind of see. I don't know how much all of that will matter, but there are some of the receivers you're looking at there could be pretty big game changers. And, if you land one or two of those guys, that could kind of shift a little bit where the receiver room is, which I'm already really high on.
Same.
But, it's funny actually, because I was talking to another, I won't throw his name out there because he was being very critical of Oregon's receiving room. And I was kind of like, really, I didn't think I don't think it's bad. He's like, oh no, they need to go get 4 or 5 more. I'm like, wow, that many more players. They need to push everybody out. Okay. I don't think it's quite that bad, but at the same time, if they did upgrade, you could see that would probably pose some nice advantages for them down the line.
I wonder if I know who you're talking about. I think I do, but we'll talk about that off air. But Erik, before we get you out of here, man, thank you so much for coming on the show. Wanted to give you a chance to, plug all of your social media, wherever people can find you and find more of your work, because you kill it, man. I love your stuff.
Oh yeah, check out my stuff over in DuckTerritory. I'm one of 3 guys in the Odds and Audibles podcast, along with Matt Preem and Jared Mack. We post a couple podcasts a week during the off season, and we get on 4 or 5 times a week during the season. Someone in the chat asked if I own Skopil's laundromat. No, my family did, and they sold it about 2 decades ago. Yeah, so the name I think still remains, but sadly, I can't take any credit for their work. And if they did poorly, definitely nothing to do with it at all.
Right on, right on. Well, guys, make sure you go tap in with Erik and read what he's got going on over at DuckTerritory. If you want to find more of me, you can follow me on Twitter at mtorresports, as well as on Instagram at mtorresports, and on YouTube at Oregon Football Max Torres. Take a second out of your day, support the channel, hit that like button, and subscribe. And then you can find all of my stuff over on ducksdigest.com. And yeah, just another awesome time. Kind of quiet on the football side of things, but if you guys follow me regularly, things are always going on the recruiting trail, and it should be a very fun time here before too long. But we're going to get out of here. Thank you guys so much for taking some time out of your day to talk some Ducks. Thanks to Erik for coming on, and we'll see you guys in the next episode of the Ducks Dish Podcast.